Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 16 of season 2 of Babylon 5 in the Shadow of Zahadum. Doesn't sound like a positive episode, does it? Seriously, word crashed on me before I even got this far on my first attempt. Non-refugees are pouring into the station, and Zack is concerned that it's just too much for them to handle, especially as Sheridan is insisting the wounded are treated before they're moved off station again. Garibaldi understands what he's saying, but it's not apparent that he wants to speak to the captain about it. Veer has been sent to find Mr Morden. He was expecting Londo, but he's on Centauri Prime consulting on the war effort. Veer is very anti-Morden. When he asks how the war is going, Veer challenges him and asks him why he's asking a question that he already knows the answer to. There then follows a classic exchange where Morden asks Veer his favourite question, and Veer tells him that what he would like is to live just long enough to see Mr Morden's head attached to a pike as a warning to the next generations that some favours come at too high a price. He would look up at his lifeless head and wave. Could Mr Morden arrange that for him, please? He takes Mr Morden's proffered data crystal and leaves, waving one last time. Garibaldi does talk to Sheridan about the Narn. He has to acknowledge that they can't deal with the volumes coming through, so it gives instructions for prioritisation. The dying are to be tended to in Medlab. Sheridan won't have them dying alone, and he's full of pity for their plight. On a screen in his office is an image of an exploration ship, the Icarus, that Sheridan's wife sent him a file on before she was killed when it was destroyed. He's finally sorting through her last effects. Garibaldi asks if he can have a look, and Sheridan is fine with that. There's nothing personal on the file. But then things do get intensely personal, because Garibaldi recognises someone he knows from the crew roster. Someone alive, and on the station, Mr Morden. Perhaps Veer will get his wish sooner than he thought. Garibaldi looks up his current records, he's not even using an alias of course, and realises he's on the station now, and Sheridan orders him brought in, by any means necessary. He wants answers as to why he's alive when everyone else from the Icarus is dead. Elsewhere, a warm and fuzzy representative from the Ministry of Peace, or Mini-Pax as they call themselves, has come to invite Talia to some chats about their shiny new mission goals of reassuring the folks back home that despite the conflicts occurring, everything is just fine for them. Not really sure where this is going, but the name sounds a touch Orwellian. In Medlab, non-casualties are filling every bed, and Franklin is nearly asleep at his desk despite taking stims. Ivanova orders him to his quarters to rest, having discovered how much sleep he hasn't had, then orders him to eat with her once he's slept. He's taking it all on his shoulders. Mr Morden is apprehended by Zack as he's trying to leave the station. When he tries to evade Zack's polite request to step to one side, he finds himself surrounded by a good half-dozen security officers with PPGs drawn, and wisely decides to stay put after all. Sheridan and Morden share an interview room before the fencing begins. Morden is shown a picture of Sheridan's wife, feigns ignorance, and is then shown a video of a news clip about the Icarus, so that defence doesn't last long. He then gives a very convincing story of being outside in an EVA suit when the Icarus blew up, being rescued by a transport, and somehow not managing to mention to Earth Central that he was actually alive when he recovered from his trauma. Sheridan, of course, is not buying that, and what are the odds of a ship just happening to pass you in space before your air runs out in that scenario? And points out that whilst Mr Morden might usually have judicial rights, right now he's officially dead, and will remain so for the next 500 years, unless Sheridan finds out the truth sooner than that. Ivanova is having the promised meal with Franklin, who's been seeing a lot of death recently despite his best efforts, and the Narn refugees keep coming. He asks Ivanova if she believes in God. She's a little indeterminate, being something of a lapsed Jew, but yes, she does, mostly. He's a foundationist, a new movement from the late 2100s after First Contact. It believes that the more you try and define God in words, the further away you get from actually doing so. Franklin thinks he sees each person's God in their final moments as they look into the far distance past him, and he's seen a lot of them today. He hopes that they still believe in us with what's going on. Sheridan is still hammering away at Morden, calling out inconsistencies in his story that Mr Morden calmly deflects. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Peace representative is offering 50 credits a week to those prepared to join a voluntary organisation called Night Watch, designed to help promote peaceful ways of thinking and correct spreaders of misinformation, bring them back into the fold. Thusly, turning them into the Thought Police. Slippery slope. Speaking of which, Garibaldi has to put his foot down. 10 hours in, Mr Morden has been charged with nothing, and Garibaldi can't have it on his watch. He pushes Sheridan, who won't back down, and so Garibaldi resigns. Sheridan appoints Zack to look after Mr Morden instead. He's called to an urgent meeting with Veer, but asks Zack to find Talia on his way out and bring her to security. Veer wishes to assert diplomatic immunity for Mr Morden, which of course piques Sheridan's interest, because he's made himself out to be a humble trader. In any event, Sheridan said diplomatic immunity only applies to criminal charges, and he's in protective custody. Protected from what? He hasn't decided yet. Ivanova then challenges him on his behaviour, and Sheridan is clear that either Morden was involved in his wife's death, or even more harrowing, his being alive means she could be too, and he's had to go 10 years adapting to reality without her, with only his career to fall back on. He asks Ivanova if she could let him go, and she says she couldn't either. Talia won't scan him, not without his permission. So sneaky Sheridan decides to move Morden to a new cell whilst Zack takes her home, along the same path. The results are reminiscent of Delenne's meeting with Morden in Signs and Portents. She sees him veiled in darkness, but more than that, she sees his alien associates next to him before she screams and blacks out into Zack's arms. In Medlab, she can't quite describe what she saw, just that it was cold. Sheridan enters and tries to apologise, but is smacked hard about the face for his trouble. In his defence, he didn't know what she was going to get subjected to. He was probably hoping for a stray thought to leak out, but of course now he knows there's a lot more to this guy than meets the eye. Franklin offers his counsel, reminding the captain that he's not in this alone. Sheridan is then accosted by Delenne and Kosh outside Medlab, telling him to release Morden as quickly as possible. When it becomes apparent he needs answers, Delenne acquiesces and says she can provide them, but in doing so he will not sleep soundly again, as he will be introduced to the greatest nightmare of their time, something she and Kosh have known for 3 years. In Delenne's quarters, she introduces Sheridan to the concept of the First Ones, races billions of years older than their own, many of whom have now passed into history, but not all. The Shadows came before even some of them, and have battled with each other down the ages, the last great war being 10,000 years ago, when they were defeated but not destroyed. Then 1,000 years ago, they started to gather their forces once more, but were challenged early by an alliance including the Minbari and the last remaining First Ones, or Ancients, now revealed to be the Vorlons. This is why Kosh cannot leave his encounter suit. He would be recognised. Sheridan asks by whom, and Kosh replies, everybody. Delenne explains that last year she asked him a question, as we are reminded of in flashback, the answer to which was yes. But we haven't known the question until now, and it was, have the Shadows returned to Zahadum? Of course, Sheridan knows this name, as Jakar has been warning them about it all year. Now Kosh decides to give Sheridan the answers he was looking for more directly, by beaming projections straight at his eyes. The Icarus had been sent to a world to investigate ancient unknown ruins, but as we see and are told, this world was actually Zahadum. There they awoke the Shadows from their hibernation. Those that would not serve were killed lest they warn others. Sheridan seizes on the possibility that Anna might still be alive. Last time the Shadows awoke, they moved too quickly, allowing them to be defeated once more, but this time they are moving slowly, carefully. Delenne implores Sheridan to cut Morden loose, because the key advantage that they have is that the Shadows do not know how much they know, which gives them some chance to prepare before they strike. This time they only have the Vorlons to back them. So now Delenne asks Sheridan to make the most important decision of his life, as he asked Jakar to earlier in the season, to choose the lives of billions over his own desire for revenge for his wife. In the cell block, Sheridan recounts the history of the bombing of Coventry to Zack. Churchill had broken the Enigma code, so knew Nazi movements in World War II, but when told of an attack by virtue of the code having been broken, could not sacrifice the advantage by preventing the attack or evacuating the city. He had to make a choice between tipping his hand and allowing the death of a city to end the war sooner. He chose the latter, and the war was won, but Sheridan says he could see how that decision haunted him. Then he hears a strange whisper from the monitors and remembers Delenn saying Morden is never alone. He has Zack scan different wavelengths in the cell, revealing the shadows with him. Zack doesn't see them, but it cements Sheridan's decision to cut Morden loose. He returns Garibaldi's badges of office and he accepts them, Sheridan telling him that he was wrong and there won't be a repeat. Zack joins Garibaldi straight after, wearing his new Night Watch armband for the money. Sheridan goes to Kosh's quarters and tells him he's cut Morden loose, but there's a price. Now he wants Kosh to teach him how to fight the shadows, because he's going to Zahadum. Kosh says that if he goes to Zahadum, he will die, but Sheridan says that if he does, he won't go alone, and repeats his question. Kosh gives a resigned affirmative. So, this is really a crucial, pivotal moment in the series that still takes time out to look at the suffering that war causes all concerned, whilst also reminding us that some wars are bigger than others. It opens up a lot of new paths in the process and ties back directly and indirectly to clues that have been laid down for a while now. So let's start small. Morden's a cocky so-and-so, so it's delightful to see Veer take him down a peg or two and turn his own question back on him. Well played, Veer. Less delightful, of course, to then see Veer try to get him released on Londo's orders later, but again that's a massive clue for Sheridan going forward, which is ironic given the bluff he played earlier in the series to get Londo to allow non-refugees to leave Quadrant 14 in the coming of Shadows. We can see that Earth Force now wants to win hearts and minds. Earth Dome wants to win hearts and minds, or at least monitor them. And of course they'd want Talia on side, because who better to discreetly keep an eye on minds on behalf of Night Watch? The rest are just amateurs. Of course, the cash is a clever incentive, because even if it doesn't attract true believers, it gets a Night Watch message out into the open. Also interesting that it's branded as the Ministry of Peace, yet the Night Watch membership drive seems to be the main objective of the visit. Note that Franklin started taking stims, as we know other medics have in the series, but at least Ivanov has caught him pushing himself too hard and interceded. The whole Narn situation is clearly going downhill very rapidly for this many refugees to be getting pushed through the station so rapidly. Sheridan unintentionally reveals to us by using Talia that Morden's associates can be detected by a telepath in close proximity, and I was going to add even a low-powered one, but then of course Talia has been tweaked as we know, and it could be that enhancement that allowed her to see Morden's nature and his associates. Hard to say, and even Talia herself was uncertain as to what she actually saw when asked. One thing is certain, she did not appreciate being used by Sheridan in any way, shape or form. So let's turn now to the Icarus and what the Morden revelation leads to. We see Sheridan casting everything else aside, including his chief of security, in his devotion to his lost wife and his thirst for the answers. He has offered much advice along the way until finally Delenn and Kosh and history, in more ways than one, change his mind. Before this episode we had no clue as to Morden's personal history before becoming an agent for the Shadows, and now of course we have it writ large, and it's a massive game changer because in trying to unlock the enigma, intentional name drop, of Morden's existence, Sheridan's quest shoves the first pebble down the hill, leading to the avalanche of the revelation that follows. It takes a little unpicking, but this is what we know. The predecessors of the current races were ancient beings known as the Ancients or First Ones. Most have now passed beyond the veil, but of them, the Shadows have been at odds with the others down the ages and conflicts have ensued. 10,000 years ago, the Shadows were fought to a standstill by the other First Ones, after which many of the First Ones left. Then 1,000 years ago, the Shadows started to move again, but did so too rapidly, and some of the younger races, amongst them the Minbari, allied with the Vorlons, the last remaining First Ones, drove them back once more. It seems that Kosh is inside his encounter suit to conceal his true identity, yet we already know he and Morden have had an encounter, which presumably means that what the Shadows are unaware of is the degree to which the Vorlons are sharing their knowledge of the current movements, rather than their presence being undetected as such by the Shadows. So Sheridan has to choose between showing their hand fully and causing the Shadows to move before Delenn and Kosh are ready, resulting in billions of deaths, or swallowing his revenge until they are ready. He picks the latter, but he wants in on the action, clearly, now needing Kosh to train him not to understand Kosh, but to fight the shadows, so he can go to Zahadum for answers. I really like the Churchill analogy Sheridan gives to Zack, not only because it's historically accurate, but because this is an American show using a British Prime Minister as an example of meritorious conduct, which I found very refreshing. So yes, pivotal moment. Now Sheridan is not only set against his own government, in league with his senior staff, he is set against the shadows, in league with Delenn and Kosh. That's a lot of irons in the fire bouncing around inside his head, and as Franklin reminds him, he doesn't have to do it all alone. Yet right now he's really split down the middle, and it will be interesting to see how he starts to come to terms with this. Just in terms of production here, it's nicely paced, the camera moves around the holding cell a lot, and nice that the callback to Delenn's questions in black and white, whilst we also see CGI of the Icarus on approach to and landing on Zahadum, as well as a fairly clear shot of a shadow at home into the bargain. At this point we almost know more about them than we do the roll-ons. I've flown the flag for Season 1 before now, and I still do. But as I get deeper into Season 2, I do appreciate why people might choose to recommend it as the starting point for people, because it is doing a lot of story development at pace, and very stylishly, when you put it up against Season 1. Yet even saying that, it had to develop from somewhere, of course. From focusing a lot on a station trying to keep the peace after a small war, this episode has suddenly ratcheted things up to a galactic level, with billions of lives at stake. You'd be crying foul if they tried to do that in a single season, but think back even as far as Infection in Season 1, which pinned a major conflict to a point 1,000 years ago. The Book of Jaquan clearly captured that conflict too. That, pronouns various, is universe building rather than just episodic writing for the sake of it, which for the time this show was made was essentially unheard of up until this point. So there's the unanswered question about whether Talia could see shadows because she'd had her ability amplified. Another question I have here is what actually happened to the Icarus. Sheridan has always said it exploded, but who reported on that with what evidence? Did it get sent back by the shadows and purposefully destroyed so that others wouldn't search for it and perhaps follow it back to Zahadum? Did someone specifically order it to Zahadum, or was that an accidental find? I may have missed that in the episode, sometimes I miss these little details, so apologies if I have there. I do love this episode. The newsgroups lit up like Christmas trees after this one because it just explodes the scope of the show so far away from just a show about a space station that it's almost funny. We've seen it venture further out than that before, of course, but this is a very personal tie-in to events in the past, and the far past too, which makes it personal for the viewer and raises the stakes higher even than the Narn Centauri conflict we've seen pieces of to this point. This whole season has been really assured to this point, and Sheridan here is really a fully fledged character too, a really human character now, where I found him a little two-dimensional when we first met him. Now we see him emotional, invested, angry, committed. So that was the last episode on that disc, and we haven't got that many more left in this season. It's not going to get any quieter, I can tell you. I'll catch you for the next one.